Hello CIS25. Sorry about the late post for this video. This video we are going to talk about chapter 4, which is going to be on cloud and virtualization. So cloud computing is a server that is at another location. So it's usually related to a remote server. And remote servers would be able to provide storage, host websites, be able to integrate database, infrastructure, network, and there are different type of services for cloud computing. And cloud servers resides in a large server farm in data centers, and these powerful servers host many different type of virtual machines. And I believe in the lab this week, we touched on AWS and how AWS you can use the EC2, which is the virtual machine versions on AWS. And the reason why we would use virtual machine is that it would eventually, the company offer virtual machine services is because it's affordable, it's easy to manage, and so therefore you would see virtual machines or virtualization being implemented with cloud computing. And customer would be able to choose the type of services that they utilize based on the capacity or the need of their systems. And so the flexibility with cloud is that it's going to give them the customer the capacity and that it can grow with the company. So in the cloud, we would see that we can have applications. So we can have program that we're executing. We can have storage like your Google Drive or your OneDrive. And also we can have different type of services like a whole network, be able to connect. And you're only going to be able to implement internet connections in that case. So cloud is going to truly be dependent on your internet connection. Now, when we get into the different type of services, we would see that IaaS stands for Infrastructure as a Service. This allows the customer to purchase access to data center infrastructure, such as storage, network, and networking services. So they can have a file server, they can have Active Directory to be able to allow user management and group management, or they can also have DNS, domain name service, and so on. So they can put the infrastructure of their organization, which includes networking, on the cloud, which is at a remote server. So now we would see that the flexibility in this is that the virtual resources will allow them to expand or adjust based on the need of the organization. So IaaS puts users in charge of the software in the certain applications or certain type of productivity suite will be then incorporated inside the operating system that will be offered through the cloud. And so when you do infrastructure as a service, you can take a look at different products such as AWS, stands for Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, IBM, and you do have some product that's coming from Google and other companies, but those are the three main ones that you see in the market. Now, software as a service, SaaS, refers to software that is hosted on the servers and that will be accessed through the web browser. So software as a service is used to provide applications for different type of systems such as thin client, which is a small scale computer that has minimal hardware that is connected to the network and eventually the internet to be able to access applications, virtualizations, and so on. Also, mobile devices like smartphone and tablet will be utilizing software that can be distributed from the cloud, which incorporates SaaS. So as long as we can provide services that is browser oriented and it's connected through the internet, that would allow the user to be able to download apps, run the apps, and on their devices. So a good example for this would be your Gmail, which is your Google Mail, and that is provided by Google. So Gmail servers can provide Gmail services to anyone that has web browser. Another good example would also be Microsoft Office 365, where the user can log in and be able to create Word documents, spreadsheets, presentations on PowerPoint, use their calendar, and so on. There are other examples such as Expressbook, Salesforce, Basecamp. So those are some of the type of software applications that would be available via cloud services. So for A+ exam, you need to know what SaaS is and what IaaS is, along with PaaS, Platform as a Service. And this is a type of service that allows vendors to develop, deploy application software on the cloud environment. And it is going to be concentrated in software features instead of issues with servers and hardware and operating system. So some of the major vendors include Oracle Cloud, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Salesforce, and vendors have many different types of services to choose from across multiple platforms. Language and the server-side support is needed in this type of environment. So the programming languages that's chosen, the development for the server technologies for the app that will be incorporated for the organization. So some of the languages that are known in this type of environment would be Java, Ruby, PHP, Python, and many more. So you would see that company would utilize this to really support their applications and their organizational need. The cost of PaaS is usually by the hour or could be monthly charge or annually charged. And they would have the amount of data that would be utilized to be able to support PaaS. So there would be a pre-commitment cost and an estimation. And so with that, company would then be charged based on the pricing packages that's being offered by these major vendors. So to answer the questions for the Unit 6 assignment, it asks you to define cloud computing, and these are remote servers that could include virtualization technology that offer computing services such as program execution, storage, and development. For the second question, it asks you to identify 3 types of cloud computing. We mentioned that there's IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. It consists of storage, network, or networking. Second type is SaaS, software as a service, that provides software applications via the web and utilize the browser. PaaS is the third type, and that's platform as a service, and this is used for development of applications and software tools. So the benefits and features of IaaS would be that it is flexible in virtual resources, and the company can pay for usage as necessary. The user can take charge of the operating system and the software applications, while the provider supplies the hardware equipment and the networking. So on the software side, the company would be managing that, and then the cloud service provider would be managing the hardware equipment and the networking. Now, for the security part, you would see that it's usually at least 50% on the agreement of the company and the provider, depending on the contract, but usually it will be both parties that will be responsible for maintaining the security, mostly the company that's contracting with the cloud service provider. Number 4 asks you which companies are predominantly provide IaaS, and that's your AWS from Amazon, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and IBM. And for question 5, it asks you to identify 2 types of software as a service that you are currently using. And I'm only listing some of the things that you would see that would commonly be used, but you're welcome to add more. So Microsoft Office 365, your Google Suite, like Docs and so on, and then TurboTax, your QuickBook Online. And so you can see there are a lot of different options as what you would see being available as software via the cloud. For number 6, 2 types of company that provide PaaS, platform as a service, would be Oracle Cloud, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Salesforce Cloud Platform. Those are some of the major ones, but you do see other available vendors such as IBM and so on. Now for number 7, ABC Corp is looking to acquire PaaS service for software application projects. What should the company consider before selecting PaaS service provider? We need to look at language and server-side support. Make sure that the vendor that is selected supports the type of languages, so the programming languages used in the development, and the server-side technologies for the app. Second, the ABC Corp needs to consider the integration of the existing investments. Cloud platforms can work with the existing resources instead of require them to be replaced. So it needs to smoothly transition from what the company currently have to what we would incorporate cloud PaaS service. Third, the company should consider costs, and that would be a pre-commitment cost estimation for the software tools and the services needed, or bundling necessary services. So these are some of the important areas that we need to look at when we're evaluating PaaS service. Now in the next part, it goes into different types of cloud. So we have public cloud computing, which is available to any organization and anyone, and individual can sign up or sometimes have to be paying for the extra service, but it is available to everyone. Private cloud computing is going to be for only authorized users in the department of a single company, and private cloud computing is available via the company that owns it, so they would have their own data center, and so the company would then need to maintain those type of system using firewall and security appliance, and private cloud is considered more secure than public cloud computing. The third type is hybrid cloud computing, which combines public and private, and hybrid installation includes dedicated and cloud-based servers, high speed interconnections. There's some load balancing in how traffic can flow and be distributed across the network of the cloud, and that's going to allow the company to be flexible for the needed operations. And then the fourth type is your community cloud computing. This is a hybrid cloud computing that's used in different organizations that are working together. So that will be shared across multiple organizations, and this is a way that they can split up the costs, also to work together toward a certain project. So that way, and then the cloud will be dissolved when the project is finished. So those are the types, and you can incorporate these details for number 8. So what type of cloud computing environment is often found in an enterprise? You would often see that they would have hybrid cloud where they would include private and public. Sometimes only private, but you do see a mix. So for the user and the internal user. So for the external user, like their clients or the customer. For number 9, it asks you what is the primary difference between internal and external cloud environment. Internal cloud is built and owned by the organization, which is considered private cloud. So the cost of internal cloud is going to be higher than outsourcing to commercial services like AWS or Azure. The external cloud is the solution that exists outside of the organization. It's owned by another entity or another company, such as the service provider, and the organization's physical boundaries are not going to be impacting the service provider's cloud. However, you would see that external cloud can be utilized as an outsource type of resource that would accompany with companies' existing equipment and systems to be able to save costs and also in the long run reduce manpower and maintenance and management capability. So here we would expand on number 9, and we looked at internal and external cloud environment. It's really coming down to the ownership and the management requirement in that case. So now for 10, we would identify the appropriate cloud services in this scenario. So if I have a small business and I need to use cloud service, I can pay by the hour, and that is considered a metered service. For B, Terry uses iCloud to store her smartphone contact lists and photos. That's considered cloud storage service. And then for C, Gotham employees uses Gmail to access email inbox, outbox, and contacts, and that would consider offsite email application service. So that way the user can use the browser to simply access their company's inbox, outbox, and contact via Gmail. And Google does offer the service to organization. And then for D, Coffee.com requires cloud services that has flexibility to adjust to high or low on sales throughout the year, and that is considered a rapid elasticity. So when you see a cloud service provider stating elasticity, that means that they're able to make adjustment for the usage based on what the company would use, sometime high or sometime low. Now, all of this information you can find on the page 3 and 4. So it talks about internal cloud here and external cloud. And then it goes into rapid elasticity. So this gives you scalability to either reduce your usage because you don't have much need for it, or you can scale it up where you can increase the usage depending on, the type of operation that you need as a business. And then we have on-demand, which is a shortened term for on-demand self-service. And this is from SaaS, software as a service, such as Salesforce.com, Gmail, and others, that would allow the customer to pay for what they would need and be able to maintain by the customer. So if I need additional storage, I can pay for additional storage. Otherwise, if I'm able to use a certain amount of free storage that's provided by Google or other company like Microsoft, I can do so. So a technique that we would see that's used with cloud service provider is called resource pooling. This refers to dynamic combinations of service provider that would support server, storage, network connections, and infrastructure. This allows multiple organizations to be able to reduce or increase the need based on, what they would combine. And measured service or metered service is what you would see that they would monitor the quality and the effectiveness of the cloud service. And so they would have metrics, which are tables and scales that would measure the actual service that they have adopted based on the pricing. So In the meter service area, you would see that the cloud services are calculated by the hour, the minutes, and then we can look at the savings based on whether the feature that would be provided is driven by high growth. So if you're able to invest into the cloud service and have high return on investment, that will be more effective than if you have the service and you don't have such a high return on investment. The next part goes into offsite email applications. And we talked about Google Gmail. There are other companies. Microsoft offers Outlook.com, which can be incorporated with Microsoft Exchange Server. So that way the user can use the browser and the internet connection to be able to access their email account. So then in that case, the company would then acquire the service by Google, Microsoft, or service provider, and to be able to maintain less of an expensive solution. So we can reduce costs by housing the mail in another location. Therefore, we have the name offsite. And more often we would see cloud file storage services. We would see this with Dropbox, iCloud, OneDrive, Google Drive, and so on. So then we would be able to utilize either free cloud storage services, or we would then pay for additional or the cloud service storage that we would use. And this allows the device to be synchronized so that way it can share data effectively across the network or multiple devices. So then we would incorporate authentication where it would be mutually agreed. So it would verify the identity of the user on the server side and then be able to give the user the privilege to be able to access different part of the file server system and so on. Now, mutual authentication, when you're looking at cloud, a lot of companies implement what's called single sign-on, which is SSO. While it does have vulnerability, it creates convenience for the user. So Apple, Microsoft, Google, and many companies incorporate single sign-on. And they do use multi-factor authentication, like you have to receive a text message along with an email and using a password to be able to access these type of applications that would then have the login credential tied to a certificate that would then be given to a certain system or the user. So single sign-on is convenient. It's definitely being incorporated for a lot of the cloud service that you use, from storage to applications to the network. Now, many cloud servers would have virtualization or virtual computing environment where you would have what's called instances for software operating system to run, so we can run many different type of OSs on each of the instance and be able to establish a virtual network. And so therefore we can also use desktop environment and be able to connect to it via the web. And there are many different type of products that will be available. Sometimes you would see companies use virtual application streaming to be able to allow the user to have device that would connect for applications. And it would use simple RAM on the actual device and for storage purposes and basically communication port, communication adapter, or some kind of communication point to be able to access the application. Virtual application streaming resolve a lot of the issues with hardware requirement and maintenance on the actual physical server at the facility. So then it would give more results and it would allow the user to access it anywhere. So implement the virtual application streaming would require licenses. So you would see that there are the major costs is in the software area, and also to really the maintenance side of this is to make sure that the user privilege is properly set up and along with the application. Now, virtual desktop refers to a desktop environment that's hosted on a remote server, which is the cloud, and it uses what's called a VDI, which is virtual desktop infrastructure. So when we did the lab with the virtualization with VirtualBox, you do see a VDI file. Simply, the virtual desktop infrastructure is stored on a server that is being owned and managed by another company remotely. With this, we would see that we would require less power. We just have to have internet connection, and we would require less hardware for on the customer end. Now we also can use virtual type of hardware simulated environment where we would incorporate the network interface card as a virtual type, a logical through the software, where it would use different addresses like MAC and IP, but then it would be exactly like the network interface card. However, the virtual machine manager would then be able to we would use the configuration via the virtual machine manager to be able to configure it. So at a software level, we would treat it like a hardware device. However, it's still going to be able to utilize a physical network interface card in order to connect. So it sees itself as two types. So at the software level and at the hardware level. So then what you would have is you would be able to connect to the physical NIC and be able to communicate via the network interface card. Client-side virtualization product of this kind would be your Microsoft Hyper-V and Oracle VirtualBox, VMware, VMware Fusion. So what you see is these are the hypervisor that would allow you to manage server systems that would offer services to the desktops, which are clients, or the devices that are connecting, or your mobile devices, which are also client. Virtualization allows this computer to run multiple operating systems at the same time. So we don't have to have multiple sets of hardware, but using the software, we're able to virtualize many different types of systems at once. So then we would see that there are a few things that we need to familiarize ourselves with as far as terminology for CompTIA A+. Virtual Machine Manager, which is your VMM. This is considered a hypervisor, like what we talked about with VirtualBox, VMware Player. Those are the software that you use to create and manage virtual machines. And then when you create the virtual machine, which has the operating systems and appropriate applications, it uses the hypervisor to access hardware resources like memory, CPU, network, video, and so on. Those are called virtual machines. And we've done this in our lab where we create virtual machines using Ubuntu Linux and also VirtualBox as the hypervisor. Then we have emulation, which involves software-based reproduction of various operating systems without the functionality of the resource of virtualization. So it's different than virtualization. When you create the virtual machine in emulator, you would then use virtualized storage ports, video, and other hardware. However, in the emulator, what you see is the virtual machine would then be set to simulate a real physical system, and so it would run in a full production with different OSs compared to what you've seen in the regular OSs, what we use for the desktop and the virtualization technology. So in the virtualization, the physical resources like RAM, processor, and storage on the disk would then be divided between the host computer, which is a computer that you use your desktop to create the virtual machine on, and it's going to share the resource between the host and the virtual machine. And the OS can be loaded to each of the virtual machine. In the emulator, you would have a full production of different OSs that uses different hardware, and it creates an application that used to emulate and run the software that's made for that operating system. So to incorporate emulators, you would use the router and the switch to be able to test on how the system would be communicated and be able to convert in different part of the cloud into your network. And so the modern PC would be able to incorporate the emulators as they would have capability to use RAM and connectivity. So there are different categories of virtualization. You have host and guest, hypervisor, server hosted, and client-side virtualization. So for the host and the guest, the PC or the workstation would run standard OS, and that runs inside the operating system, where each virtual machine is a guest of the host system. So the host system is the system, the desktop that you're using to create the virtual machine and run the virtual machine on. The guest virtualization is the virtual machine itself. So then it's able to communicate and treat it like separate systems across. Now, the purpose of virtual machine is really simple. It's just to be able to maximize your hardware by using software. So that way we can virtualize many different type of systems that would have server roles on one single machine. It saves us money, and it's able to also reduce maintenance and so on. Now, we also can create backup images for these virtual machines, and we can use it for testing purposes. So virtual machines allows us to really scale based on what we need with a lot less cost. And so the actual computer hardware is reduced, and so therefore we would then be able to move forward with maintaining the applications better. For the resource requirement, you would have RAM, you would need to have multi-core processors, you would need to have storage on disk, and be able to support different type of processor like 64-bit or 32-bit. And so in a single virtual machine, you would see that on the host system, we need to have more than 4 gig of RAM. So with using 4 gigs of RAM is going to be limited, but then if you're able to support more RAM, that will be flexible for the virtual machine. Then in your system and BIOS, you have to enable the VT, or the VTX, which is the virtualization technology that allows your processor to see the virtual machine. So here it talks about how your firmware needs to be able to support that feature. So if you have an older processor like the i3, you will not be able to run virtualization on an i3. So i5 and later would allow you to do so. So legacy processor would not support virtualization. Now, we also need to take a look at the speed of the processor, and along with the RAM, the type of RAM that we have, and the amount of RAM, along with the disk storage that you would need to really store the virtual disk. Even though it doesn't take as much as your regular physical type of operating system that require physical disk, it would still take up some storage space. So for the emulator requirement, require the operating system, the hardware to be originally used with the operating system. So it also requires faster processor and RAM along with the hardware to really emulate. And you also need to use BIOS or UEFI to enable the processor support in virtualization, even though it's using emulator, and also to be able to use a certain software product for the emulator requirement. Now, the security requirements, as I mentioned, that we need to monitor network traffic. So while it's on the cloud, it doesn't mean that the service provider is fully responsible for the security. If anything, the company, the customer that acquired that service would then be responsible for 50% or more in the security area. And we also need to make sure that there's backup in place for the virtual machine. And so we would create image that would be either the VDI or the VMX in the case of VMware to be able to use that virtual machine as in case something happens. So we can create a backup of the virtual machines. We also be required to update and manage the patches on the applications and the OS side for any kind of cloud virtual machine based systems or any kind of service that we would have with the cloud. So security is important that we looked at how the system can be isolated. We can physically partition or section the disk to really isolate a certain type of OSs to prevent certain type of attacks. And so the best practices would be that the operating system and the apps of the VM should be kept up to date. We need to use firewall, anti-malware, and different types of security software to really maintain day-to-day operation in a secure manner. And your connection needs to, between the VMs, need to be protected. So we would still implement either software or hardware firewall to really connect to the cloud server systems. And sometimes cloud company would charge you additionally for enhanced security features on their cloud environment. For the network requirement, we of course need to have a way to connect, so network interface card or Wi-Fi adapter. We need to be able to configure the network area in the hypervisor via the VMM, which is the manager. And so the settings need to set up, we would need to connect and authenticate in order to establish security credentials that will allow the user to access different areas of the cloud systems, whether it's for applications, storage, or overall just networking services. And hypervisor, we talked a little bit about this earlier. So hypervisor is used to run and manage virtual machines, and the virtual machines is considered a guest machine, and the system that runs the hypervisor is considered a host machine. There are two types of hypervisor. Type 1 is going to be based on virtualization that's referred to what's called bare metal virtualization, and this is often used by web hosting companies or companies that offer the solutions using hypervisor and virtual servers for thin client environment where it's just a small, minimal hardware system that will connect and access the desktop. Now, the type 2 hypervisor is used to run OSs, and you can load different type of OSs onto the virtual machine, including Windows and Linux, and that allows the system to be having multiple operating system running at once. So what we did in the lab the other day when we create the Linux virtual machine is the type 2 hypervisor, where type 1 hypervisor, you would see that when you're seeing a system that would connect to the cloud for the desktop environment. So going back to the questions for our assignment, it asks you to describe virtual computing for number 11, and virtual computing technology creates and run multiple instances of software OS, multiple software systems sharing the resources of the hardware system is known as virtualization. we talked about the differences between virtualization and emulation. Virtualization enables a single computer to run 2 or more OSs at the same time using the same hardware resources. Emulator involves software-based reproduction of various OSs, but without the functionality and the resources of virtualization. So completely removed from the virtualization. And for 13, in-host or guest virtualization, which operating system connects to the hardware directly, and that will be your host machine. And because your guest machine still use the physical hardware to be, so it has the middle, it requires the host in order to connect. Now for 14, if you don't have Windows PC, you can install VirtualBox instead of the VMware player, but this is a free product that's provided by VMware. If you use VMware often, you would see Workstation, not the player, is a trial version and it's only available for 90 days. But Workstation Player is a free version and it's not a trial version. So you can use it to create virtual machines. And unlike VirtualBox, you would see that the file format is a little different, the interface is a little different, but ultimately we can still achieve the same thing using VMware Player. So this walks you through on how to do it. If you don't have Windows PC, you can install VirtualBox and you can take a screen capture of that instead. Now for 15, you can use the internet browser to really look up what VirtualBox is. And so once you visit this website, make sure that you answer these questions. It asks you what type of OS platform does it support? Can you install that on Mac OS, Linux, or Windows, and so on. So make sure you look at the different type of OS you can use it with. And then also the current version of VirtualBox. And this changes from time to time as they update the versions. So you can take a look at the stable versions compared to some of the beta versions, but look at the current version that's available right now. I know in the lab for this last week, we use a version that's installed by MVC in class on campus. And that is not the latest version. However, if you do look at the latest version, you can download and install on your system. And then for C, what devices are supported by VirtualBox extension packages? Please look at the extension packages and answer the questions. And that concludes the assignment. However, when you take a look at the notes, right, it goes into the last part of the hypervisor. And this is a fairly short chapter, so you should be able to answer this without having to watch this video. You can also research the questions online and be able to get more details about virtualization and cloud computing. However, the textbook does provide you with the details that you need, and make sure that you are familiar with the terms so that way you can complete the CompTIA certifications down the line. And thank you for watching this video, and this is for CIS25, Chapter 4.